Hi, I'm Matt. Just wanted to go through another game that I played over the board this time, which is hopefully of interest. This was the second to last game I played over the board this season on 8th of April 2019. My opponent for this game was graded 166 ECF, which is something a little bit above 1900 FIDE, and the time control was all moves in 70 minutes but with a 10-second increment. So again, same as all my games, I played one e4. My opponent played knight f6, which is Alekhine's Defence. I don't really know the lines against this particularly well, so I just tend to play my pieces to sensible squares and see what happens. So e5 is fairly standard. Knight to d5, d4, d6, c4, chasing this knight away, a knight to b6, and then pawn takes pawn, which is about as far as I know with any real certainty. My opponent played c takes d6. The other recapture is about as popular, so e takes d6 is played as well quite a lot. I played knight to c3. My opponent played pawn to g6. I then played my knight to f3. So my teammate told me that this is maybe a little bit inaccurate because black can now bring the bishop out to g4 with a slightly awkward pin on the knight. White tends to move the bishop out first. The other option I thought about was playing pawn to h3 because, as I say, black will often want to put the bishop out onto here. If it can't go to g4, then maybe it doesn't have any really good squares. My opponent carried on, fianchetted the bishop on g7. I played bishop to e3, defending this pawn. Knight to c6, putting a bit more pressure on the pawn. So the knights are kind of pressuring the pawns, the bishop's pressuring from the diagonal. I played my bishop to e2, just still developing and putting my pieces onto sensible squares. Actually, on this move and on several subsequent moves, the computer prefers to play pawn to d5. I was a bit worried that my opponent's knights would just hop into e5 and c5, but computer line goes something like knight e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, bishop d4, and essentially claims that white's just a little bit better here, which I can kind of understand. So anyway, I played bishop e2. Nothing too exciting happening so far. Castles, queen d2, thinking of coming in here and maybe playing something on the king side. My opponent played bishop f5 here, which I don't think was the best move. I guess he's aiming for c2. Maybe sort of bringing a knight in here. But I was expecting something along the lines of, instead of bishop f5, I was thinking of bishop g4, and then pawn to b3, pawn to d5, pawn to c5, knight to d7, which looks reasonably equal, I think. So white's got a little bit more space, but black's doing pretty well. Computer actually, instead of bishop f5 in this position, prefers d5 straight away. And then c5, knight c4, bishop c4, dc4, d5, knight b4, castles. Looks like an interesting line for both sides. So after bishop f5, I play my bishop to h6 here. Computer still wants me to play d5 here. So again, I'm worried a bit about c5 and e5, but the computer says just knight b4, so threatening knight c2, rook c1, bishop to g4, so it wants to play that anyway, but black's just wasted a move here. b3, knight d7, a3, knight a6, b4, which is actually quite similar to something we got in the game, and white's clearly better here. So bishop h6, opponent played e5, breaking in the centre. I thought he would go for d5 instead, although I think it's fairly similar in terms of the positions that you get. So after e5, I played bishop takes bishop. My opponent played king takes bishop. I then played my pawn to h4. So I played this I thought that black needed to stop me from playing h5, h6, and that he had an option of either h6 or h5 himself, which was actually not necessarily that easy to calculate. So if h5, then you're leaving h5 straight away, then you're leaving a hole on g5 for the knight maybe to come in. If h6, then you need to think whether white can play h5 and then g5, and then you've maybe got a bit of a hole on f5. Neither of them I think are particularly bad, but it gives black something to think about. So d5 is still the move that the computer prefers here, after which you go knight b4, castles, and then knight back to a6, and white's a bit better. Opponent played after pawn to h4. He thought for quite a long time, so you can argue that h4 is a bit of a time-wasting move, because actually once black plays h6 or h5, white doesn't really have a huge attack on the king's side, needs to focus more in the centre. So it's arguably a slight waste of time in terms of the chess-wise, but in terms of actually practically, my opponent wasted quite a lot of time thinking about h6, so practically it was probably a good decision. So h6, and now I played d5. My idea of playing it now was that now black's stuck a pawn onto e5, so he doesn't have chance to put a knight onto this e5 square, so he's only really got this c5 square to aim a knight at. And I felt that if I needed to, I could control it with b4. So d5, my opponent played knight to b4, obviously threatening to bring the knight into c2. And I played my rook to c1, defending the c2 square. Black brought his knight back to a6 before I had chance to kick it away. I decided here at this point to reroute my c3 knight across to e3, as you can see from the green arrows, with the idea of both defending c4 and attacking the bishop on f5. One point to make is that a3 here wouldn't be a particularly great move, because although it takes control of b4, it makes a big hole on b3. So a line that you might get here would be rook c8, threatening the c4 pawn, knight d1, and knight c5, and black's clearly starting to take over on the queen side here, threatening knight b3 straight away. So instead of, I didn't play a3, I played knight to d1, and my opponent played rook to e8. I'm not quite sure what he's doing here actually. I mean, I guess he's trying to push e4, but if he pushes e4, then I just bring my knight onto d4, so it doesn't seem like pushing e4 actually gains him anything. And he really ought to just get on with rearranging these two knights, which aren't best placed at the moment. So we need something like knight c5, and then we get h5, g5, b4, knight e4, and then queen e3. And this is a position that computer evaluates as equal, but there's clearly a lot of play. It's quite an interesting position here. So rook e8. I brought the knight into e3, actually. So as mentioned, threatening the bishop and defending this pawn. I can actually, instead of this, just get on with playing on the queen side. I think I was still thinking that maybe I had something on the king's side, because my pieces are kind of aiming in that general direction. But actually, really, I ought to be playing on the queen side. So this b4 move is pretty strong at this point. The knight e3, and black played bishop back to d7. I think again he ought to rearrange his knights here. Knight c5, Pawn to h5 here, knight e4. This is similar to a position that we saw earlier, although now the queen has to go backwards and forwards. And then b4 again. This looks playable from both sides. 1 point after knight c5. So my opponent was obviously worried about me taking his bishop, but actually knight takes f5, g takes f5, b4, knight e4, queen c2, and actually this pawn center here is pretty strong for black, and white can't get any of his pieces at the black king. Black stands pretty well here. So bishop d7 is the move my opponent played instead of this knight c5 idea. I thought for quite a while here. I was trying to think, well, what could I make work on the king side, h5 or something. But then eventually I realised that actually I should be making something of these awkwardly placed knights and playing on the king side instead, queen side instead. So I played the move b4, so stopping this knight jumping in onto c5. And my opponent here played a slightly weak move, although black is actually struggling here already. He played rook to c8. And then here I will stop you for 5 seconds to stop the video and see if you can see what white's next move is here. Okay, and the next move that I played here is pawn to c5, and the arrows appear. So I'm threatening takes d6, takes b6, but also very importantly, this move bishop takes a6, which is a very nice intermediate move that comes in a second. So knight to a4 from black here. c6 just wins a piece because you can't take b takes c6 because the bishop takes a6. So that's no good. So black has to play pawn takes c5 here. And then we've got this, instead of just capturing back with the pawn, we first take the knight here. And this leads to a big white advantage because black has to take here and then pawn takes here. And the c pawn and d pawn are absolute monsters here. Compare them to a7 and a6, which are just horrible. c5 and d5 just push through and are going to win the game. Opponent played knight to a4, so threatening this c5 pawn, but this obviously can just move forwards c6, threatening the bishop. Bishop to f5. Now, next move I played, again, I thought for quite a long time here, because I knew I was winning the game, but I was a bit concerned that I might let my opponent back in. So the computer likes this h5 move. I was a bit worried about bishop to e4, which is the move that I wanted to block. But actually, looking a little bit further, hg6, fg6, knight to g4, and the black position just falls apart very quickly here because there's nothing you can do to stop all the white pieces coming in on h6. Rook h8, rook h6, bishop f3, rook h8, queen h8, gf3, and then these two pawns, the c and d pawns, will just run through the position and white will make a queen. So yeah, I didn't need to worry as much as I did about the black bishop coming to life. So back in this position here, instead I played queen to b4. Of course, I'd seen that black could obviously move his knight back to b6, and then I decided to reorganize with rook d1, just defending d5. White does need to be a little bit careful in this position here. So if you're thinking that white could maybe just push this d6 pawn, rook e6 is rather embarrassing because black is going to pick up one or both of these two passed pawns, because c7 you just take on d6, or excuse me, or d7, you just take on c6 and then take on d7 as well. So you can't push too far forward with these pawns. So rook d1. My opponent played queen c7 here. Black actually has an interesting, tricky alternative here with bishop to d3, which I hadn't seen at all. So it just leaves the bishop on freeze. But after rook takes d3, we have e4, forking rook and knight. Rook d2, pawn takes knight. And then now we're threatening to take on d5 because this knight is pinned to the king. The line here, which wins for white, but it's not trivial at all, is actually castles. Pawn takes pawn, and rook c1, and white's still winning. But yeah, certainly finding castles isn't trivial. So queen c7. Here I played my pawn to g4, and if we look at this point, black's bishop has no moves at all. Can't go to any square. The computer doesn't like this move at all. It prefers pawn to h5, with the point here that something like rook to d8, queen to h4, rook to h8, queen to g3, and everything's attacked. The g-pawn, bishop on f5, the pawn on e5, and white's just winning easily in this position. But after g4, my opponent played a weak move, but can you maybe see what move would, if not save the day, certainly give white a bit of a headache? So the move that black should play here is pawn to a5, threatening this queen and freeing up a square for the bishop when the queen moves. Potentially this gives white a real headache. So firstly, queen takes a5. Suddenly black is at least equal. Bishop e4, pinning this knight here. Rook h3, and then knight takes d5 is quite a cute tactic. So the knight defends the queen and the queen attacks the white queen. White's got nothing better than to take on c7, but then this is nothing at all. This is equal. So after a5, I'd have to have found queen c5, and then we get a line bishop e4, rook h3, knight to a4, queen to a3, and then knight back to b6. White is still better because of these two pawns in the centre, but actually black's still definitely hanging on in this position. It wouldn't be easy to win. Unfortunately, my opponent had run out of time by this point and played this move rook b8 very quickly. And unfortunately for him, this doesn't help him at all. His idea is that he's going to take this and uncover an attack on the queen. But I can just take pawn takes g5. That wins a piece. He played knight takes d5, uncovering attack on the white queen. But then there's a counter attack on black's queen. So rook takes b4, knight takes c7, and white's just two pieces up. Instead, in this position, my opponent played queen takes c6. At this point, white can win as he pleases, but I played, I think, the best line, which goes pawn to f6, king to h7. The only reason I'm showing this is for a nice checkmate at the end. Knight g5, why not? Pawn takes. He can't play king to g8 because queen b8 is quite cute. Rook b8, knight e7, forking king and queen. So pawn takes knight on g5, pawn takes, so opening up the attack with the rook, king to g8, and now I played queen to h4, which threatens checkmate and forced resignation. But there is actually an even quicker mate. So again, just take 5 seconds and can you find white's checkmate in 2 moves? And yeah, in this position, there's only so many moves that you've got, but queen f8 would have been a lovely checkmate. So rook takes f8 and knight to e7 is checkmate because the h-file is defended by the rook. And alternatively, after queen f8, king to f8, rook to h8 is also checkmate. So yeah, I hope that you enjoyed the game. I enjoyed playing it, and hopefully I'll be annotating a few more games in the future. So thanks for listening.